Don't sign anything, Grandma. Not yet. Those words from my 15-year-old grandson Marcus echoed through my kitchen as I sat there with trembling hands, staring at the legal documents my son David had spread across my dining table like some kind of twisted birthday present. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was happening exactly 3 months after I'd buried my husband of 47 years, and here was my own flesh and blood, trying to convince me that signing over my house was somehow an act of love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Patterson, and at 72 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak life could throw at me. I was wrong. The worst betrayal was still coming, and it would come wearing the face of someone I'd sacrificed everything for. But this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about discovering that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and that wisdom doesn't always come with age. Let me take you back to where this nightmare really began, because like most family disasters, the seeds were planted years before they finally bloomed into something poisonous. I met my husband Robert when I was 19 years old, working as a secretary at Patterson's Auto Parts in downtown Cedar Falls, Iowa. He was the owner's nephew, fresh out of the army, with calloused hands and the most honest smile I'd ever seen. We married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at First Baptist Church, and I thought I had everything figured out. Love, security, a future stretched out ahead of us like a well-maintained highway. Robert worked his way up, from sweeping floors to managing the entire business when his uncle retired. We bought a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, with a wraparound porch and enough room for the family we planned to have. For the first 10 years of our marriage, we tried desperately to have children. Month after month of disappointment, of medical tests that led nowhere, of watching our friends' families grow while ours remained stubbornly small. Then, when I was 31 and had almost given up hope, David came along. Not the way we'd planned, but through the foster system. He was 7 years old, angry at the world, and had been through 4 different homes in 2 years. The social worker warned us he might be difficult to place permanently, that his behavioral issues made him a challenge. But when I looked into those defiant brown eyes, I saw a little boy who just needed someone to believe in him. Robert and I threw ourselves into being David's parents with the fervor of people who'd waited too long for something precious. We attended every school function, cheered at every Little League game, helped with homework every night at the kitchen table. David was smart, maybe too smart for his own good, but he struggled with authority and had a temper that could flare up without warning. Still, we loved him fiercely and believed that patience and consistency would eventually heal whatever wounds his early years had left. By the time David turned 18, I thought we'd succeeded. He graduated high school with decent grades, talked about maybe going to community college, and seemed to have found his footing. Robert had been grooming him to take over the auto parts business someday, teaching him about inventory management and customer relations. David seemed interested, or at least he pretended to be. That's when everything started to change, though so gradually I didn't notice it at first. David became increasingly critical of how Robert ran the business, suggesting we were missing out on opportunities to expand or modernize. He started bringing home books about real estate investment and entrepreneurship, staying up late reading about ways to quote assets and maximize returns. The language he used became more sophisticated, more calculating. "Mom, Dad," he announced one Sunday dinner when he was 22. "I've been thinking about our future. The auto parts business is dying. Everything's going online now. We need to think bigger, invest in property, build real wealth while we still can." Robert set down his fork and looked at our son with the patience of a man who'd spent years trying to understand him. "David, the business has supported this family for 30 years. It's honest work, and there's dignity in serving the community. Dignity doesn't pay for retirement, Dad. You and Mom are getting older. What happens when you can't work anymore? You'll be stuck living on Social Security, barely scraping by. But if we liquidate the business assets and invest in real estate, we could secure everyone's future." I remember feeling uneasy about the conversation, though I couldn't put my finger on why. David's concerns seemed legitimate on the surface. Robert was 58 then, and the physical demands of the business were wearing on him. But something about the way David presented his arguments felt rehearsed, like he'd been practicing this speech. Over the following months, David became increasingly persistent about his investment ideas. He brought home printed articles about people who'd made fortunes in real estate, stories about families who'd lost everything because they'd been too conservative with their money. He started questioning every financial decision Robert and I made, from our choice of insurance policies to how much we kept in savings. "You're letting inflation eat away at your nest egg," he'd say, shaking his head like we were children who couldn't understand basic math. "That money needs to be working for you, not sitting in some bank account earning pennies." The pressure became constant, subtle but relentless. David would leave real estate magazines lying around the house, marked with articles about, quote, seniors who waited too long to secure their financial futures. He started inviting himself over for dinner more frequently, always steering the conversation back to money and investment opportunities. Robert, bless his heart, tried to be supportive of David's ambitions while holding firm on his own principles. "Son, if you want to invest in real estate, that's your choice. But your mother and I are comfortable with how we've managed our finances. We've worked hard for what we have, and we're not looking to get rich quick." That's when David's tone started to change. The respectful disagreement gave way to barely concealed frustration, then to something that felt almost like contempt. He began making comments about our small-town mentality and our fear of taking calculated risks. He suggested that our reluctance to embrace his ideas was somehow holding him back from achieving his potential. "I'm trying to help you build generational wealth," he'd say, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But you're so stuck in your ways, so afraid of change, that you can't see the opportunities right in front of you." The worst part was how he made me feel guilty for not trusting his judgment. Here was this young man we'd raised, who seemed to have such sophisticated knowledge about finance and investment, and we were the stubborn old people too, set in our ways to listen to wisdom. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe David was right and we were being foolishly conservative. Then came the night that changed everything between us, though I didn't realize it at the time. David had been particularly persistent that week about a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity he'd discovered. A commercial property downtown was going up for auction, and he was convinced we could buy it, renovate it, and double our money within 2 years. All we needed to do was liquidate the auto parts business and use our house as collateral for a loan. Robert had been fighting a particularly bad cold that week, and he went to bed early, leaving David and me alone in the living room. That's when my son looked me straight in the eye and said something that still gives me chills. "Mom, Dad's holding you back, you know that, right? He's so terrified of losing what little you have that he can't see how much more you could have. You're the one."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"With the real intelligence in this relationship, you're the one who should be making the financial decisions." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so calculated, made my stomach turn. This wasn't a son trying to help his parents. This was someone trying to manipulate me into betraying my husband's trust. "David," I said carefully, "your father and I make decisions together. We always have. That's what marriage means. But what if he's wrong? What if his fear of taking risks costs you the comfortable retirement you deserve? Mom, you've sacrificed so much for this family. Don't you think you deserve better than scraping by on a fixed income?" There it was, the hook he'd been preparing for months. He wasn't just questioning Robert's judgment. He was positioning himself as my champion, the one person who truly understood what I deserved. It was manipulation disguised as devotion, and it scared me more than I wanted to admit. I told Robert about the conversation the next morning, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. We'd both sacrificed so much to give David a stable home, and this felt like he was trying to drive a wedge between us for his own purposes. "Maybe we made a mistake," Robert said quietly as we sat on our porch that evening, watching the sun set over our neighborhood. "Maybe we protected him too much, gave him too much without teaching him to appreciate what he had." I took his hand, feeling the familiar comfort of his calloused palm against mine. We did the best we could with what we knew. That's all any parent can do. But privately, I was starting to worry that David's problems ran deeper than simple impatience or ambition. There was something calculating about the way he approached relationships, something transactional that made me uncomfortable. He seemed to view every interaction as an opportunity to get something he wanted, and he was getting increasingly angry when people didn't cooperate with his plans. The tension came to a head on David's 25th birthday. We'd planned a family dinner at home, just the three of us, like we'd done every year since he'd come to live with us. But David showed up an hour late, clearly agitated about something, and immediately launched into another lecture about our financial short-sightedness. "I've been watching other families in this town," he said, not even bothering with pleasantries. "The Hendersons sold their farm and invested in apartment complexes in Des Moines. They're making 3 times what they used to. The Kowalskis liquidated their hardware store and bought rental properties. They're set for life now." Robert sighed deeply. "David, we've been through this. We're not the Hendersons or the Kowalskis. We're happy with our life the way it is." "Happy?" David's voice rose sharply. "You're happy living paycheck to paycheck? You're happy knowing that one medical emergency could wipe out everything you've worked for? You're happy being slaves to a business that's barely profitable?" "That business put food on this table and clothes on your back," Robert said firmly. "It paid for your education and gave you opportunities. I won't apologize for choosing honest work over get-rich-quick schemes." David stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. "You know what your problem is? Both of you? You have no vision. No ambition. You're content to be small-town nobodies, working small-town jobs, and you want to drag me down with you." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I'd been slapped. Robert's face went pale, and I could see 20 years of love and sacrifice crumbling in his eyes. "If that's how you really feel about us," Robert said quietly, "maybe you should think about whether you want to be part of this family." David's expression shifted from anger to something cold and calculating. "Maybe I should. Maybe I've outgrown this place and everyone in it." He left that night and didn't speak to us for 3 months. When he finally called, it was to announce that he'd moved to Chicago and gotten a job in real estate. He said he was sorry for the harsh words, that he'd been under a lot of stress, and that he hoped we could rebuild our relationship. But he never apologized for what he'd said about our life, and he never acknowledged how deeply he'd hurt us. For the next 15 years, our relationship with David remained cordial but distant. He'd call on holidays and birthdays, visit once or twice a year, and send polite cards for major occasions. But there was always an undercurrent of judgment in his interactions with us, a sense that he was tolerating our simple lifestyle rather than respecting it. He married a woman named Patricia when he was 30, and they had 2 children, Marcus and Sophie. Patricia seemed nice enough, though I always felt like she was evaluating Robert and me when she visited, measuring us against some standard we couldn't see. David had clearly told her that his parents were small-town people with limited understanding of the world, and she treated us with the kind of careful politeness you'd show to elderly relatives you felt sorry for. Marcus, though, was different from the start. Even as a small child, he seemed genuinely interested in spending time with us. He'd ask Robert to teach him about car engines and beg me to show him how to bake the chocolate chip cookies I'd been making since David was little. When David would start lecturing us about investment opportunities or criticizing our lifestyle choices, Marcus would roll his eyes and change the subject. "Grandpa, tell me about when you fixed Mrs. Johnson's car with a coat hanger," he'd say, clearly trying to redirect the conversation away from whatever uncomfortable territory his father was heading toward. As Marcus got older, the dynamic became even more apparent. David seemed frustrated that his son didn't share his obsession with wealth and status, while Marcus gravitated toward the simpler values Robert and I had tried to instill in our family. When Marcus turned 13, he asked if he could spend part of his summer vacation with us in Cedar Falls, learning to work in the auto parts shop. David reluctantly agreed, probably hoping that exposure to our small-town mentality would cure Marcus of any romantic notions about simple living. Instead, Marcus threw himself into learning the business with enthusiasm that reminded me of Robert at that age. He was mechanically gifted, patient with customers, and genuinely interested in understanding how things worked. "Dad thinks what you do is beneath him," Marcus told Robert one afternoon as they organized inventory in the shop. But I think there's something cool about fixing things, about helping people solve problems. Not everything has to be about making money. Those words would prove to be prophetic, though none of us knew it at the time. When Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at age 71, David's reaction was both predictable and heartbreaking. Instead of offering emotional support or asking how he could help during the illness, his first question was about our financial preparedness for the medical expenses. "Mom, I hope you and Dad have good insurance," he said during his first phone call after the diagnosis. "Cancer treatment is incredibly expensive. If you haven't planned properly, this could bankrupt you." Robert fought the cancer with the same quiet determination he'd brought to everything else in his life, but the disease moved faster than the treatments could keep up. During his final months, David visited twice, both times staying only long enough to have tense conversations about estate planning and insurance policies. Marcus, on the other hand, spent his entire spring break that year helping me care for his grandfather. He was 14 then, old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough to accept it with the resilience of youth. He'd sit by Robert's bed reading aloud from car magazines or playing chess when Robert felt up to it. "Your grandson is a good boy," Robert told me during one of his clearer moments near the end. "He's got character, real character. Don't let David mess that up." I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but I would soon enough. Robert died on a Tuesday morning in October, holding my hand as the first autumn leaves drifted past our bedroom window. The funeral was well attended. Robert had touched a lot of lives during his years in business, and the whole community seemed to mourn his passing. David gave a eulogy that was technically appropriate but felt emotionally hollow, full of platitudes about Robert's legacy and quote, 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 quote. Marcus, however, spoke from the heart about a grandfather who taught him that there was honor in honest work and that the measure of a man wasn't in his bank account, but in how he treated other people. There wasn't a dry eye in the church when that 14-year-old boy talked about learning life lessons in an auto parts shop. After the funeral, family and friends gathered at our house for the traditional meal. I moved through the crowd like a sleepwalker, accepting condolences and thanks for hosting, but feeling disconnected from everything around me. The house already felt empty without Robert's presence, and I couldn't imagine how I was going to fill the silence that stretched ahead of me. David stayed for 3 days after the funeral, ostensibly to help me get organized and deal with practical matters. What he actually did was go through Robert's papers with the thoroughness of an auditor, asking pointed questions about insurance policies, pension benefits, and the value of our assets. "Mom, you're going to need to make some decisions," he announced on his final evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Robert's financial documents spread out like evidence in a court case. "The house is worth about $300,000 now, and with Dad's life insurance and the business assets, you're looking at close to $500,000 in total wealth." The way he said wealth made my skin crawl, like he was talking about some kind of prize we'd won, rather than the result of 47 years of marriage and hard work. "That sounds like a lot," I said carefully. "But this is my home, David. The business was your father's life's work. I'm not ready to think about liquidating anything." David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mom, you have to think practically. You're 72 years old, living alone in a big house you can't maintain properly. The business requires daily management that you're not equipped to handle. You need to convert these assets into something more manageable. I've been helping Robert manage the business for 30 years. I think I can handle it for a while longer." Helping is different from running, Mom. And what happens when you get sick? What happens when you need assisted living or long-term care? Those costs can easily run 6 figures a year. If you don't plan properly now, you could end up losing everything anyway. There was something in his tone that reminded me of that conversation we'd had 15 years earlier, when he'd tried to convince me that Robert was holding me back. The same calculated concern, the same underlying suggestion that I was too naive to understand my own situation. "I appreciate your concern," I said as firmly as I could manage. but I'm not ready to make any major decisions right now. I'm still grieving your father, and I need time to figure out what comes next." David's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. But just remember, the longer you wait, the more complicated things become. Markets change, property values fluctuate, opportunities disappear. I'd hate to see you miss out on securing your future because you waited too long to act." He left the next morning with promises to call regularly and offers to help with anything I needed. But something about the way he looked at the house as he drove away made me feel like he was already mentally dividing up the assets, already planning his next move. I tried to settle into my new reality as a widow, but everything felt wrong without Robert. The house was too quiet, the business felt overwhelming without his steady presence, and the future stretched ahead of me like an uncharted territory. I'd never lived alone before, never. October, holding my hand as the first autumn leaves drifted past our bedroom window. The funeral was well attended. Robert had touched a lot of lives during his years in business, and the whole community seemed to mourn his passing. David gave a eulogy that was technically appropriate but felt emotionally hollow, full of platitudes about Robert's legacy and quote, 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 quote. Marcus, however, spoke from the heart about a grandfather who taught him that there was honor in honest work and that the measure of a man wasn't in his bank account, but in how he treated other people. There wasn't a dry eye in the church when that 14-year-old boy talked about learning life lessons in an auto parts shop. After the funeral, family and friends gathered at our house for the traditional meal. I moved through the crowd like a sleepwalker, accepting condolences and thanks for hosting, but feeling disconnected from everything around me. The house already felt empty without Robert's presence, and I couldn't imagine how I was going to fill the silence that stretched ahead of me. David stayed for 3 days after the funeral, ostensibly to help me get organized and deal with practical matters. What he actually did was go through Robert's papers with the thoroughness of an auditor, asking pointed questions about insurance policies, pension benefits, and the value of our assets. "Mom, you're going to need to make some decisions," he announced on his final evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Robert's financial documents spread out like evidence in a court case. "The house is worth about $300,000 now, and with Dad's life insurance and the business assets, you're looking at close to $500,000 in total wealth." The way he said wealth made my skin crawl, like he was talking about some kind of prize we'd won, rather than the result of 47 years of marriage and hard work. "That sounds like a lot," I said carefully. "But this is my home, David. The business was your father's life's work. I'm not ready to think about liquidating anything." David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mom, you have to think practically. You're 72 years old, living alone in a big house you can't maintain properly. The business requires daily management that you're not equipped to handle. You need to convert these assets into something more manageable. I've been helping Robert manage the business for 30 years. I think I can handle it for a while longer." Helping is different from running, Mom. And what happens when you get sick? What happens when you need assisted living or long-term care? Those costs can easily run 6 figures a year. If you don't plan properly now, you could end up losing everything anyway. There was something in his tone that reminded me of that conversation we'd had 15 years earlier, when he tried to convince me that Robert was holding me back. The same calculated concern, the same underlying suggestion that I was too naive to understand my own situation. "I appreciate your concern," I said as firmly as I could manage, "but I'm not ready to make any major decisions right now. I'm still grieving your father, and I need time to figure out what comes next." David's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. But just remember, the longer you wait, the more complicated things become. Markets change, property values fluctuate, opportunities disappear. I'd hate to see you miss out on securing your future because you waited too long to act." He left the next morning with promises to call regularly and offers to help with anything I needed. But something about the way he looked at the house as he drove away made me feel like he was already mentally dividing up the assets, already planning his next move. I tried to settle into my new reality as a widow, but everything felt wrong without Robert. The house was too quiet, the business felt overwhelming without his steady presence, and the future stretched ahead of me like an uncharted territory. I'd never lived alone before, never. Weeks. Why was David so convinced that I needed to be rescued from my own life? Why was he so determined to solve problems I didn't think I had? Over the next few days, as Marcus and I worked together in the shop and around the house, I started to see my situation more clearly. I wasn't struggling as much as David wanted to believe. Yes, I missed Robert terribly, and yes, running the business alone was challenging. But I was managing just fine, and more importantly, I was finding purpose and comfort in maintaining the life Robert and I had built together. Marcus saw it too. "You're not helpless, Grandma. You're just sad." There's a difference. On Thanksgiving Day, David called to check in, and for the first time in weeks, I felt strong enough to push back against his pessimistic assumptions. "Mom, how are you holding up? Marcus isn't wearing you out, is he?" Marcus has been wonderful. He's helped me catch up on some repairs around the house, and we've been going through the business books together. I'm feeling much more confident about managing everything. There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "That's great, Mom. I'm glad you're feeling better. But having a good week doesn't mean you're equipped to handle everything long term. And I hope you're not burdening Marcus with adult responsibilities. He's just a kid." I'm not burdening him with anything. He has to learn about the business, just like he did when Grandpa was alive. He's actually very insightful about inventory management. Another pause. "Mom, I think we need to have a serious conversation about realistic expectations. Just because Marcus is interested in the business doesn't mean it's a viable long-term solution for you. You need to think about professional management or liquidation, not rely on a 15-year-old's enthusiasm." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with David systematically dismissing every positive development I mentioned and redirecting the discussion back to my supposed inability to cope with my current situation. By the time I hung up, I felt like I'd been through a psychological evaluation conducted by someone who'd already decided I was incompetent. Marcus had been listening from the kitchen, and when I came back in, he was frowning thoughtfully. "Grandma, why does Dad want you to sell everything so badly? It's like he's trying to convince you that you can't handle your own life." Out of the mouths of babes. That 15-year-old had identified the core problem in a way that cut straight through all of David's elaborate rationalizations. He wasn't trying to help me manage my life. He was trying to convince me I couldn't manage it myself. "I think," I said carefully, "your father believes he knows what's best for me better than I do. But that's not his decision to make, is it?" "No, sweetheart. It's not." That conversation marked a turning point in my understanding of the situation. David wasn't waiting for me to ask for help. He was waiting for me to admit defeat. He wanted me to reach the conclusion that I was overwhelmed, incompetent, and in need of rescue. Then he could swoop in as the dutiful son, taking control of my assets and my decisions in the name of protecting me. The problem was, I wasn't overwhelmed or incompetent. I was grieving and adjusting, which are normal parts of major life transitions. But David couldn't afford to let me succeed on my own, because my independence threatened whatever plans he'd made for my inheritance. When Marcus went back to Chicago after Thanksgiving, I felt more alone than ever, but also more determined. I'd gotten a glimpse of what my life could be like if I stopped listening to David's constant predictions of doom and started trusting my own judgment. I could run the business, maintain the house, and build a meaningful life as a widow. I just had to resist the pressure to accept David's version of my limitations. That pressure increased dramatically over the Christmas holidays. David, Patricia, and the kids came to Cedar Falls for their usual holiday visit. But this time felt different. David spent most of his time photographing the house, supposedly for insurance purposes, but I caught him taking detailed pictures of every room, every piece of furniture, every sign of wear or needed repair. He also spent considerable time on the phone with people he claimed were insurance adjusters and property assessors. But the conversations I overheard sounded more like consultations with real estate agents. He was gathering information about market values and liquidation timelines, preparing for decisions I hadn't agreed to make. On Christmas Eve, after the kids had gone to bed, David sat me down for what he called a frank family discussion about the future. "Mom, I've been doing some research, and I think we need to accelerate our timeline for getting you situated. The housing market is strong right now, which means this is an optimal time to sell. But if we wait too long, market conditions could change, and you could lose significant value." Patricia nodded supportively. "Eleanor, David's just trying to make sure you're protected. We all want what's best for you." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I haven't decided to sell anything. This is still my home." David pulled out a folder filled with printed documents and spreadsheets. "I know change is scary, but look at these numbers. If we sell the house and liquidate the business assets, you'd have enough money to buy a beautiful condo in a retirement community, with plenty left over for long-term care insurance and emergency funds. You'd never have to worry about money again." The way he presented it made it sound like a gift he was offering me, rather than a plan to strip away everything that gave my life meaning and structure. But I was starting to recognize his manipulation tactics, and I wasn't going to be pushed into decisions that served his interests more than mine. "David, I'm not ready to make those kinds of changes. Maybe someday, but not now." His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Mom, I'm trying to help you think rationally about this. Every month you delay costs you money. Property taxes, maintenance, utilities, business overhead. It's all eating into your nest egg. And what happens if you have a medical emergency? What happens if you fall and can't live independently anymore? You could lose everything if you don't plan properly. Those are all possibilities, not certainties. I could also stay healthy and happy in my own home for the next 20 years. I could successfully run the business and leave an even larger estate than what I inherited. You're asking me to plan for the worst-case scenario instead of hoping for the best one. I'm asking you to be realistic." David's voice had an edge now, the carefully controlled tone of someone whose patience was running thin. "Mom, you're 72 years old. The statistical likelihood of major health problems or cognitive decline increases dramatically after 75. I'm trying to help you make smart decisions while you still can." That phrase, "while you still can," hit me like a slap. David wasn't just questioning my current judgment. He was suggesting that my mental competence had an expiration date, and that date was approaching fast. He was laying the groundwork to declare me incapable of making my own decisions if I didn't voluntarily surrender control to him. The conversation continued for another hour, with David presenting increasingly dire scenarios and Patricia chiming in with supportive comments about how hard it must be for me to face these difficult realities. By the time they went to bed, I felt like I'd been through a psychological assault, designed to convince me that I was delusional for thinking I could manage my own life. But Marcus had been listening from the staircase, and after his parents went to their room, he crept down to the kitchen where I was sitting with a cup of tea, trying to process what had just happened. "Grandma, that was messed up," he said quietly. "Dad was talking to you like you're some kind of invalid who can't think straight. But you're not. You're smarter than most people I know." "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you know. Why does he want you to sell the house so badly? It's like he's obsessed with it." I looked at this perceptive 15-year-old and decided he was old enough to understand the truth about his father's motivations. "Marcus, your dad is my heir. When I die, everything I own will go to him. Right now, that inheritance includes a house, a business, and various investments that would require time and effort to manage or liquidate. But if I sell everything now and put the money in simple investment accounts, your dad's inheritance becomes much easier to handle." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "So he wants you to do his work for him?" "Essentially, yes. That's really selfish. It's human nature, I suppose. But it's also my decision to make, not his. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to live my life the way I want to live it, for as long as I can. And I'm going to resist anyone who tries to convince me I'm not capable of making my own choices." Marcus smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like Robert. "Good for you, Grandma. Good for you." That conversation with Marcus crystallized something important for me. I wasn't going to let David's fears and financial calculations determine how I spent my remaining years. I was going to trust my own judgment, maintain my independence, and build the life I wanted rather than the life he thought I should have. But David wasn't finished with his campaign to convince me I needed saving. In fact, his efforts were about to become much more aggressive and much more frightening. The gentle pressure and rational arguments were about to give way to something that looked a lot more like a coordinated attack on my competence and independence. And if it hadn't been for Marcus, I might not have recognized what was happening until it was too late. The new year brought with it a shift in David's strategy that I should have seen coming but somehow didn't. The gentle persuasion and concerned suggestions gave way to something more systematic, more calculated. It started with small things that seemed innocent enough but gradually built into a pattern that left me questioning my own perceptions. In January, David began calling me 3 times a week instead of twice, always with specific questions about incidents that had supposedly happened. Had I remembered to turn off the stove after making dinner? Had I paid the electric bill on time? Was I sure I'd locked the front door before going to bed? When I assured him that I was managing these basic tasks just fine, he'd express relief but then mention that Patricia was worried because elderly people often don't realize when they're starting to slip. The phrase "starting to slip" became a constant refrain in our conversations. David would bring up news stories about seniors who'd been victimized by scams, articles about the early signs of dementia, statistics about accidents in the homes of elderly people living alone. He presented this information as educational, claiming he just wanted me to be aware of potential risks, but the cumulative effect was to create an atmosphere of constant anxiety about my competence. Then came the visits from people I hadn't asked to see. In February, a woman named Janet Hoffman showed up at my door, introducing herself as a social worker from the County Department of Aging Services. She was pleasant enough, explaining that she was conducting routine wellness checks on seniors in the community, but something about her visit felt choreographed. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand you've recently been widowed. That's such a difficult transition. How are you managing with the daily tasks of running a household?" I invited her in for coffee, more out of politeness than any real desire for company, and found myself being subjected to what felt like a subtle interrogation. She asked about my medical care, my social connections, my financial management, and my long-term plans. When I mentioned that I was still running my late husband's auto parts business, she raised her eyebrows in concern. "That sounds like quite a responsibility for someone in your situation. Do you have family helping you with the business decisions?" "My son David has offered to help, but I'm managing fine on my own." Of course. But family support becomes so important as we age. It's wonderful that your son is looking out for you." The entire conversation left me feeling like I was being evaluated for something I hadn't signed up for. When I mentioned the visit to David during our next phone call, his response was telling. "Oh, Janet Hoffman contacted me last week to let me know she'd be stopping by. I gave her your information because I thought it would be good for you to have connections with community resources." You can never be too prepared. "You gave her my information? Why didn't you ask me first?" "Mom, I didn't want to worry you unnecessarily. These wellness checks are routine for people in your situation. I just wanted to make sure you had access to support services, if you needed them." There was that phrase again, "people in your situation," as if being a 72-year-old widow automatically placed me in some category of helplessness that required outside intervention. A week later, Dr. Martinez called to schedule what he described as a, quote, "comprehensive geriatric assessment." When I pointed out that I'd just had my annual physical 3 months earlier and everything had been fine, he explained that David had expressed some concerns about my adjustment to widowhood and thought it might be beneficial to do a more thorough evaluation. "Your son seems very caring, Mrs. Patterson. He mentioned that you've been under a lot of stress lately, trying to manage property and business responsibilities that might be overwhelming for someone your age." I was beginning to see the pattern. David was systematically contacting professionals in my life, expressing concerns about my well-being, and positioning himself as the worried son trying to ensure his elderly mother received appropriate care. To anyone on the outside, his behavior would look exemplary. But from my perspective, it felt like he was building a case against my competence without my knowledge or consent. The medical appointment was particularly unsettling. Dr. Martinez put me through a series of cognitive tests that seemed designed to identify early signs of dementia or other mental decline. I passed all the tests easily, But the fact that they were being administered at all sent a clear message about what David had been telling people about my mental state. "Mrs. Patterson, your cognitive function appears excellent for someone your age," Dr. Martinez assured me at the end of the appointment. "But your son mentioned that you've been making some unusual financial decisions lately. Have you been considering any major changes to your living situation or investment portfolio?" "Dr. Martinez, my financial decisions are perfectly sound. I'm not sure why my son would suggest otherwise." Of course. Family members sometimes worry unnecessarily. But it's always good to have these conversations while cognitive function is clear, just in case circumstances change in the future. There it was again, the subtle implication that my current competence was temporary, that cognitive decline was inevitable and imminent. David was laying groundwork for a future argument that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions, and he was using medical professionals to validate his concerns. When I got home from that appointment, I called Marcus. I'd been reluctant to burden him with my growing anxiety about his father's behavior, but I was starting to feel like I needed an ally who could see the situation clearly. "Grandma, that's really weird," Marcus said after I described the medical evaluation. "Dad's been talking to Mom about how worried he is about you, but when I was there at Christmas, you seemed totally fine. Actually, you seemed better than fine. You seemed like yourself." "What exactly has your father been saying to your mother? Stuff about how you're not thinking clearly about your finances, how you're being stubborn about accepting help, how you might be developing memory problems. But Grandma, I was with you for a whole week. Your memory is better than mine." "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. When you're around me, do I seem confused or forgetful or unable to take care of myself?" "No, absolutely not. You seem like the same person you've always been, just sadder because Grandpa died. But that's normal, isn't it? People are supposed to be sad when someone they love dies." That conversation with Marcus helped me realize that David's campaign wasn't based on legitimate concerns about my well-being. It was based on his desire to accelerate a timeline that would serve his financial interests. He needed me to be incompetent in order to justify taking control of my assets, so he was working to create evidence of incompetence where none existed. But David's most aggressive move was yet to come, and when it happened, it nearly destroyed everything I thought I knew about my son and myself. In March, David arrived in Cedar Falls without advance notice, claiming he'd had a business meeting in Des Moines and decided to stop by for a surprise visit. But instead of the casual family visit I was expecting, David brought with him a briefcase full of legal documents and a plan that took my breath away. "Mom, I've been doing a lot of research and consultation with financial advisors, and I think we've reached the point where we need to make some concrete decisions about your future." He spread papers across my kitchen table with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this presentation many times. There were real estate assessments, business valuations, investment prospectuses, and legal documents with terms I didn't recognize. I found a beautiful retirement community in Des Moines called Golden Valley Estates. It's only an hour from Chicago, so Patricia and I could visit regularly, and they have excellent medical facilities on site. Look at these photos. The brochures showed elegant apartments, manicured gardens, and smiling elderly residents engaged in various activities. It looked pleasant enough, but it wasn't my home, and I had no desire to live there. "David, I've told you repeatedly that I'm not ready to leave Cedar Falls. This is where my life is." "Mom, I understand that change is difficult, but we have to be realistic about your limitations. You're 72 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for you, trying to run a business that requires physical stamina you don't have anymore. I have plenty of stamina, and the business is doing fine." David pulled out a folder filled with financial projections and spreadsheets. "Actually, the business isn't doing as well as you think. I've been analyzing the books, and profits have declined significantly since Dad died. You're hemorrhaging money, and you don't even realize it." I stared at the numbers he was showing me, trying to make sense of spreadsheets that supposedly represented my own business. According to David's analysis, I was losing thousands of dollars every month and would be bankrupt within 2 years if I continued operating the way I had been. Those numbers can't be right. I balance the books every week. We're profitable. "Mom, with all due respect, you don't have the training to do sophisticated financial analysis. These projections take into account depreciation, market trends, overhead allocation, and dozens of other factors that aren't apparent in simple bookkeeping. The confidence with which he presented this information was staggering. Either David had somehow discovered serious problems with the business that I'd completely missed, or he was manufacturing a financial crisis to support his argument that I needed professional management of my affairs. "I want to have an independent accountant review these projections," I said. "Of course, that's a smart idea. But Mom, time is a factor here. The longer we wait to make these decisions, the more money you lose. I've already put a hold on the apartment at Golden Valley Estates, but I can only maintain that hold for 30 days. That's when he pulled out the most frightening document of all, a power of attorney form that would give David complete control over my financial and medical decisions. "This is just a precaution," he explained, his voice taking on the soothing tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "It doesn't change anything right now, but it ensures that if something happens to you, if you have a medical emergency or start experiencing cognitive decline, I can step in immediately to protect your interests." I picked up the document and tried to read through the legal language, but the terms were dense and confusing. As far as I could tell, signing this paper would essentially give David the authority to make any decision about my life that he deemed necessary. "David, this seems very extreme. I'm not incapacitated. I don't need someone else making decisions for me." "Of course you don't, not right now. But Mom, these things can change overnight. What happens if you have a stroke like the Hendersons' mother did? What happens if you develop dementia? Without proper legal documentation in place, your assets could be frozen, your medical care could be delayed, your wishes might not be honored." The way he presented it made signing the power of attorney sound like a responsible precaution rather than a surrender of my independence. But something about the urgency of his timeline, the pressure to make immediate decisions, felt wrong. "I need time to think about all of this," I said. "I need to consult with my own advisors." David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of frustration breaking through his mask of patient concern. "Mom, I am your advisor. I'm your son, and I'm trying to protect you from making decisions that could destroy your financial security. But I can't help you if you won't trust me." "It's not about trust, David. It's about making sure I understand what I'm agreeing to. What you're agreeing to is letting someone who loves you take care of the details so you can focus on enjoying your retirement instead of worrying about business management and financial planning." That phrase, "someone who loves you," hit me like a physical blow, because I was starting to doubt whether David's behavior was motivated by love at all. Love doesn't pressure. Love doesn't manipulate. Love doesn't try to convince someone they're incompetent in order to control their decisions. "I'm not signing anything today," I said firmly. "I need time to review everything with my own attorney." David's mask slipped completely then, revealing the anger that had been simmering beneath his careful presentation. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. I've spent weeks researching options for you, putting together a comprehensive plan that addresses all your needs, and you're rejecting it because of some paranoid fear that I'm trying to take advantage of you." "I'm not paranoid, David. I'm careful. You're being stubborn and foolish, just like you were 15 years ago when Dad and I tried to help you think bigger about your financial future. Some people never learn." There it was, the contempt that had been lurking behind all his expressions of concern. David didn't see me as someone whose judgment deserved respect. He saw me as an obstacle to his plans, someone whose stubbornness was preventing him from accessing what he believed was rightfully his. "I think you should leave," I said quietly. "Fine, but don't call me when you're broke and homeless because you were too proud to accept help when it was offered." After David left, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the legal documents he'd left behind, trying to process what had just happened. My son had essentially presented me with an ultimatum: surrender control of my life to him, or risk financial ruin through my own incompetence. The fact that he'd couched this ultimatum in language of love and protection made it even more disturbing. I called Frank Kowalski, the attorney who'd handled Robert's estate, and asked him to review David's financial projections and the power of attorney document. Frank had known our family for 20 years, and I trusted his judgment in ways I was beginning to realize I couldn't trust David's. "Eleanor, I've gone through these numbers 3 times, and I can't figure out how your son reached these conclusions," Frank told me 2 days later. According to my analysis of your business records, you're actually doing quite well. Profits are down slightly from last year, which is normal for a business in transition, but you're nowhere near the financial crisis David is describing. So he's wrong about the numbers? He's either wrong, or he's deliberately misrepresenting your situation. Some of these projections assume market conditions and expense categories that don't apply to your business. It's as if he started with the conclusion he wanted to reach, and then worked backward to create supporting data. The power of attorney document was even more troubling. According to Frank, the language was so broad that it would give David complete control over every aspect of my life, including the authority to sell my property, liquidate my business, and make medical decisions without my input. Eleanor, I would never recommend that anyone sign a document like this unless they were genuinely incapacitated and had no other options. This isn't a precautionary measure. This is a complete transfer of authority. Frank's analysis confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. David wasn't trying to help me plan for potential future incapacity. He was trying to create a legal framework that would allow him to take control of my assets immediately, using the fiction of my incompetence as justification. But Frank also warned me about something I hadn't considered. Eleanor, if David is determined to pursue this course of action, he might try to have you declared legally incompetent without your consent. It's a difficult process, but if he can find medical professionals willing to testify that you're not capable of making sound decisions, a court could appoint him as your guardian. Can he do that, even if I'm completely competent? The standard for legal competency is complex, and it's often based on subjective judgments about what constitutes reasonable decision-making. If David can argue that your refusal to accept help constitutes poor judgment, and if he has documentation from medical professionals expressing concerns about your mental state, he might be able to make a case. That conversation terrified me more than anything that had happened so far. I was beginning to realize that David's campaign wasn't just about pressuring me to make decisions he preferred. It was about creating a legal record that could be used to strip away my right to make decisions at all. I needed help, and I needed it from someone David couldn't manipulate or intimidate. I called Marcus. "Grandma, you sound really upset. What's going on?" I told him about David's visit, the financial projections, the power of attorney document, and Frank's warnings about the possibility of forced guardianship. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Grandma, this is really serious. Dad's basically trying to steal your life. Marcus, I don't want to put you in the middle of this conflict with your father, but I'm scared. I don't know how to protect myself from someone who's willing to use the legal system against me. You don't have to protect yourself alone. I'm coming to stay with you. Sweetheart, you can't miss school just because your grandmother is having family problems. Grandma, it's spring break next week anyway, and after that I only have 6 weeks left until summer vacation. I'll talk to my teachers about doing independent study projects. This is more important than sitting in classrooms right now. What will you tell your parents? I'll tell them I want to spend time with you and help you with the business. Dad thinks that's a waste of time anyway, so he probably won't object. They'll just assume I'm going through some phase that I'll grow out of. Marcus, if you come here, you might see and hear things about your father that will be hard to handle. I don't want to damage your relationship with him." "Grandma, my relationship with Dad has been damaged for years. He's been trying to turn me into some kind of money-obsessed robot like him, and I'm tired of pretending I don't see what he really cares about. Maybe it's time for him to see what I really care about." Marcus arrived the following Saturday with 2 suitcases and a determination that reminded me of Robert at his most focused. At 15, he was still technically a child, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he understood the seriousness of what we were facing. "Okay, Grandma, here's what we're going to do," he announced as we sat in the kitchen planning our strategy. "First, we're going to document everything. Every phone call, every visit, every conversation with medical professionals or social workers. We're going to create a record that shows Dad's been systematically trying to undermine your independence. How do we do that? You're going to start recording phone conversations. Iowa is a one-party consent state, which means you can legally record any conversation you're part of without telling the other person. We're also going to keep detailed written records of all interactions, with dates and witnesses when possible. Marcus, where did you learn about one-party consent laws?" He grinned. "Internet research. I've been reading about elder abuse and financial exploitation for the past week. Did you know that family members are responsible for about 90% of elder abuse cases? And that financial exploitation often starts with small attempts to control the victim's decision-making? You think your father is financially abusing me? I think Dad has decided that your money belongs to him, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to get control of it. That's the definition of financial exploitation. Over the following days, Marcus and I developed a comprehensive plan to protect my assets and document David's behavior. We transferred my important documents to a safety deposit box that only I could access. We updated my will to include specific language about my mental competency at the time of writing. We arranged for Frank Kowalski to conduct monthly assessments of my cognitive function, creating a legal record of my ongoing competence. Most importantly, we started gathering evidence of David's manipulation campaign. Marcus was particularly clever about this. When David called for one of his regular check-ins, Marcus would listen on the extension while I recorded the conversation on my phone. David's behavior was so consistent that we quickly accumulated dozens of examples of him questioning my judgment, expressing concerns about my mental state, and pressuring me to accept his financial advice. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I'm really worried about your decision-making process, David said during one typical call. Refusing to consider professional financial management isn't just stubborn, it's potentially dangerous. What happens if you make a major mistake that costs you everything? David, I'm not making mistakes. My financial situation is stable. Mom, that's exactly what someone with declining cognitive function would say. The inability to recognize your own limitations is often the first sign of serious problems. My cognitive function is fine. I just had a complete medical evaluation. Dr. Martinez told me he was concerned about some of your responses during the assessment. He thinks you might benefit from more specialized testing. That was a lie. Dr. Martinez had told me my cognitive function was excellent, and he'd given me written documentation to that effect. But David was presenting a completely different version of events, probably hoping I wouldn't remember the conversation clearly or wouldn't have the confidence to contradict his claims. David, Dr. Martinez gave me a clean bill of health. He said my cognitive function was excellent for someone my age. There was a pause, and I could almost hear David recalibrating his approach. Mom, I think there might have been some miscommunication. When I spoke with Dr. Martinez, he expressed some concerns about your adjustment to widowhood and your resistance to accepting help with complex financial decisions. When did you speak with Dr. Martinez? Just last week. I called to follow up on your assessment because I wanted to make sure you were getting appropriate care. You called my doctor without my permission? Mom, I'm your emergency contact. I have the right to inquire about your health status when I'm concerned about your well-being. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with David systematically misrepresenting facts, questioning my memory, and positioning himself as the concerned son trying to protect an increasingly confused mother. When I hung up, I was shaking with anger and fear. Grandma, he's gaslighting you, Marcus said grimly. He's trying to make you doubt your own perceptions by consistently telling you that things happen differently than you remember them happening. How do you know about gaslighting? Psychology class. It's a classic manipulation tactic. The abuser contradicts the victim's memory of events until the victim starts questioning their own sanity. It's particularly effective with elderly people because everyone expects memory problems at a certain age. But why would David want me to doubt my own memory? Because if you don't trust your own perceptions, you'll be more likely to defer to his judgment. He is essentially trying to convince you that you can't rely on your own mind, so you need to rely on his instead. That conversation with Marcus helped me understand the psychological dimension of what David was doing. It wasn't enough for him to control my financial decisions. He needed me to believe that I was incapable of making sound decisions myself. Only then would his control seem legitimate, rather than coercive. But Marcus and I were building our own evidence base, and what we discovered over the following weeks was even more disturbing than I'd imagined. When Marcus hacked into David's computer during one of his visits to Chicago, he discovered files filled with research about guardianship procedures, legal strategies for challenging wills, and detailed financial projections based on liquidating my assets. David had been planning this campaign for months, possibly since before Robert's death. Grandma, look at this, Marcus said, showing me printouts of David's research. He's been studying how to have someone declared legally incompetent. He's got articles about successful guardianship cases, lists of medical professionals who specialize in competency evaluations, and template legal documents for initiating proceedings. The most chilling discovery was a document titled Timeline for Asset Transfer, which outlined a step-by-step plan for gaining control of my property and investments. The plan included strategies for isolating me from potential allies, creating medical documentation of my supposed incompetence, and expediting the sale of my assets once guardianship was established. "This isn't just greed," I said, staring at the evidence of David's systematic planning. "This is a deliberate campaign to destroy my independence." "It's elder abuse," Marcus said bluntly. "And it's fraud. Dad's trying to steal your money by convincing a court that you're too incompetent to stop him. What do we do with this information? We take it to the police. What Dad's doing is illegal." But when we met with Detective Sarah Walsh at the Cedar Falls Police Department, her response was more complicated than we'd hoped. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand your concerns, and some of your son's behavior does raise red flags," Detective Walsh said after reviewing our evidence. "But elder abuse cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the alleged perpetrator is a family member who can claim he's acting out of genuine concern. But we have evidence that he's been systematically lying about my mental state and manipulating medical professionals. Unfortunately, family disagreements about medical care and financial decisions aren't necessarily criminal matters. Unless we can prove that your son has actually stolen money or forged documents, it's hard to build a criminal case." "So there's nothing you can do?" "I didn't say that. What I recommend is that you work with your attorney to create legal protections that make it impossible for your son to pursue guardianship. Get multiple medical evaluations confirming your competency. Update your estate planning documents to include specific language about your mental state. Create a paper trail that demonstrates your ability to make sound decisions. And if he tries to have me declared incompetent anyway, then you'll have the evidence you need to fight back. But Mrs. Patterson, I have to warn you that these cases can get very ugly very quickly. Family members who are determined to gain control of assets sometimes escalate their tactics when legal manipulation doesn't work." "What kind of escalation?" "Sabotage. Creating emergencies that require intervention. Sometimes even physical harm that can be blamed on the victim's supposed incompetence or self-neglect." That conversation with Detective Walsh made me realize that David's campaign was likely to get worse before it got better. He'd invested too much time and planning in this strategy to give up easily, and his next moves were likely to be more desperate and more dangerous. But I had something David didn't expect: a teenage grandson who was smarter than he gave him credit for, more loyal than David deserved, and absolutely determined to protect me from his father's exploitation. The final confrontation came sooner than either Marcus or I anticipated, and it played out exactly as Detective Walsh had warned it might. In early May, David arrived in Cedar Falls with two people I'd never seen before: a woman he introduced as Dr. Rebecca Stevens, a geriatric psychiatrist, and a man named James Crawford, who identified himself as a social worker specializing in adult protective services. "Mom, I've brought some professionals to do an independent assessment of your living situation," David announced as he walked into my house without invitation. "There have been some concerning reports about your ability to manage daily activities safely." "What reports? From whom?" Dr. Stevens stepped forward with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm here to conduct a brief evaluation of your cognitive function and living situation. This is routine for people your age who are living independently. I didn't request an evaluation, and I don't consent to one." "Mom, you don't have a choice," David said sharply. "When concerns about elder safety are reported to protective services, they have the authority to conduct wellness checks whether you consent or not." James Crawford nodded officiously. "Mrs. Patterson, we've received reports that you may be at risk due to impaired judgment and inadequate self-care. We're here to determine whether intervention is necessary to ensure your safety." I looked at these three people standing in my living room and realized that David had escalated to a full-scale assault on my independence. He was no longer trying to persuade me to surrender control voluntarily. He was trying to have me declared incompetent by state authorities. That's when Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that was calm but carried surprising authority for a 15-year-old. "Could I see some identification and documentation of your authority to be in this house?" David looked startled. "Marcus, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in school." "I'm here visiting my grandmother, and I'd like to see the paperwork that gives these people the right to force their way into her home." Dr. Stevens and James Crawford exchanged glances, clearly not expecting to encounter a witness who would challenge their authority. "Young man, this is an official investigation," Crawford said. "You need to leave so we can conduct our assessment." "Actually, you need to leave," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone. "Because I've been recording this entire conversation, and what you've just done constitutes trespassing and attempted fraud." "Marcus, put that phone away," David snapped. "You don't understand what's happening here." "I understand perfectly. You've brought fake officials to Grandma's house to try to intimidate her into accepting your guardianship. But Dr. Stevens isn't a licensed psychiatrist in Iowa, James Crawford isn't employed by any state agency, and you don't have any legal authority to force entry into this house." The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went white, and his supposed professionals suddenly looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. "How did you know?" David asked weakly. "Because I called the Real Adult Protective Services office yesterday when you scheduled this visit. They told me they had no record of any complaints about Grandma, no pending investigations, and no plans to conduct any evaluations. They also told me that impersonating state officials is a felony." Marcus held up his phone, still recording. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave immediately, you're going to stop harassing my grandmother, and you're going to hope that she doesn't decide to press charges for fraud, elder abuse, and attempted extortion." David looked at me with an expression of pure hatred. "You turned my own son against me." "No, David," I said quietly. "You did that yourself." After they left, Marcus and I sat in the kitchen, both of us shaking from adrenaline and relief. "How did you know they weren't real officials?" I asked. "I didn't, not for sure. But I've been researching Dad's tactics for weeks, and I knew he was getting desperate. When he called yesterday to say he was bringing professionals to evaluate you, I decided to check whether there were actually any pending investigations. When I found out there weren't, I figured he was planning something illegal. Marcus, you saved me. If you hadn't been here, I might have fallen for their act. Grandma, you're too smart to fall for something like that. But even smart people can be overwhelmed when they're facing multiple attackers. Dad was counting on isolating you and making you feel like you had no choice but to cooperate. What happens now? Now we take all our evidence to the authorities and make sure Dad faces consequences for what he's tried to do. And we make sure everyone knows that you're completely competent to make your own decisions." The legal aftermath took several months to resolve, but the outcome was everything I could have hoped for. David was charged with attempted fraud and elder abuse. His fake professionals were also charged, and their scheme to exploit vulnerable seniors was exposed as part of a larger investigation. More importantly, the court case created a comprehensive legal record of my competency and David's attempted exploitation. No future challenge to my mental capacity could succeed given the evidence we'd assembled. David never apologized for what he'd tried to do, but he did stop contacting me entirely. His wife Patricia filed for divorce 6 months later, citing irreconcilable differences, and she was awarded full custody of Marcus and Sophie. Marcus chose to spend his senior year of high school living with me in Cedar Falls, and he's planning to study business management in college so he can eventually take over the auto parts business if I decide I want to retire. But that's my decision to make when I'm ready to make it, and not a moment before. I'm 73 now, still living in my own home, still running my husband's business, still making my own decisions about how to spend my time and my money. I volunteer at the library twice a week, I've joined a book club, and I'm learning to paint watercolors. My life isn't glamorous, but it's mine, and that's worth more than all the financial security David thought he could provide. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that family loyalty isn't unconditional. When someone tries to manipulate you, isolate you, or control you, it doesn't matter if they share your DNA. What matters is protecting yourself and surrounding yourself with people who respect your right to make your own choices. Marcus taught me that wisdom isn't always related to age, that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones willing to fight for our independence rather than trying to manage our lives. He saved me from losing everything, not just my money and property, but my dignity and autonomy. Sometimes the best revenge against someone who underestimates you is simply proving them wrong. David thought I was too old, too weak, and too confused to protect myself from his schemes. Instead, he discovered that I was strong enough to fight back, smart enough to gather allies, and determined enough to preserve the life I'd built with Robert. I sleep well at night now, knowing that my future is still my own to determine. And when I look at Marcus, working beside me in the shop that his grandfather built, I see hope for the next generation. Not everyone who carries our family name will honor what it means to be part of this family. But the ones who matter will understand that love means respecting people's choices, not controlling them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.